Sin. What did you just feel? What did you think, but what did you feel? That word did not arrive in your brain as a dictionary entry. It arrived as a verdict. Someone taught you that word before you were old enough to evaluate it. Someone loaded it with content, with shame, with fear, with the threat of exclusion. And by the time you were old enough to think and ask, who did the loading? The word already felt like a fact about reality rather than a claim made by people with an interest in your compliance. That's not an accident. That's a technology. And last night, Ryan Coogler put it on screen for 16 Oscar nominations worth of audience. I'm Lester Levitt, and this is VIYOBI. Vote in your own best interest. VIYOBI. And today I want to talk about one word, the title of the most nominated film in Academy Award history, Sinners. If you haven't seen Sinners, and I'm going to be careful here because you should see it, the setup is deceptively simple. Ryan Coogler sets it in 1932 Mississippi. Two black twins come home from the north and open a juke joint. A young blues musician plays music so powerful it pulls the past and the future into the room, and then white vampires show up. Now, every reviewer will tell you that the vampires represent colonialism. That's true, but it's not deep enough. The vampires are the easy part. What's harder, and what makes the film extraordinary, is what the title is doing. Who are the sinners? In 1932 Mississippi, who has the authority to define sin? The church that condemned the blues as the devil's music, the colonial system that made black joy itself a transgression, the doctrine that said voodoo was witchcraft and indigenous spiritual knowledge was superstition, the economic order that said a black man with his own business was stepping out of place. The people in that juke joint aren't sinners. They were made into sinners by a system that needed the word to justify what it was doing to them. And here's the detail that elevates the whole film. The vampire Remick, the one who shows up to consume, is himself Irish. He was a victim of colonization before he became a colonizer, and when he arrives at the juke joint, he says, "I am the way." He's parroting Christ, and he's using the language of the institution that colonized him to colonize someone else. The word sin has been recycled from the church to the colony to the vampire, each time providing a new warrant for extraction. Extraction of bodies, extraction of music, extraction of cultural memory. And the vampires must be invited in. They cannot cross the threshold without consent. That's not just a horror convention, that's the mechanism. The doctrine doesn't force you across the door. It teaches you to open the door yourself. It teaches you to call your own desires sin, and then tells you that that was your choice all along. You opened the door for your own oppression. Coogler didn't call this film The Vampires, he called it Sinners, because this title is the trap. So here's what I want to give you, a tool. In 1980, a rhetorician named Michael Calvin McGee published a paper in Quarterly Journal of Speech that introduced a concept he called the ideograph. An ideograph is a word that a culture uses to justify political action, even though nobody agrees on what it actually means. Think about the word freedom. Say it to yourself. What did you picture? A gun rights activist pictures something. A reproductive rights advocate pictures something different. A tech deregulation lobbyist pictures something else entirely. A civil liberties lawyer pictures a fourth thing. All of them will use the word freedom to justify their position, their argument, and defend their actions. None of them mean the same thing by it. And that's not a failure of the word. That's how the word works. Freedom, justice, family values, security, traditional, patriot. These words feel like they're describing reality, but they're actually constructing it. They're warrants, permission slips for one group to organize political life around their definition while everyone else argues about what the word means. And the trick is that the words sound so universal, so natural, so obviously true, that you never stop to ask, who wrote this permission slip and who benefits from it? Sin is an ideograph in the purest sense. The word doesn't describe a fixed feature of the universe. It mobilizes an entire moral and political architecture. And that architecture shifts completely depending on who's deploying the word and against whom and what they need to justify. In a Mormon sacrament meeting in 1985, sin meant one thing. In a juke joint in 1932 Mississippi, it meant something else. In Ryan Coogler's film in 2026, it means something else again. The word is identical every time it's used. The political work it does, who it includes, who it excludes, who it protects, who it condemns, is a completely different operation in each case. That's the ideograph. And once you can see it, you can't unsee it. Every political argument you encounter will start showing you the ideographs it depends on. Every time someone tells you we need to defend liberty or protect the family or secure our way of life, you'll hear the machinery. You'll ask, whose liberty? Which family? Whose way of life? And who had to disappear for that definition to feel natural? Or who had to be disappeared? I know something about this machinery because I lived inside it for 44 years and I wrote a book about it called Forbidden Friends. Same question, different word. Who decided the friendship was forbidden? I'm a 7th generation Mormon. I came out at 44. I married a black man named Mickey. My memoir traces what happened when I crossed every line the governing narrative had drawn around me. The line around sexuality, the line around race, the line about what you're allowed to think and how loudly you're allowed to think it. The Mormon Church didn't need guards or fences to keep me in the closet for 30 years. The doctrine taught me to forbid myself. The word should was the only wall they needed. You should marry a woman. You should pray it away. You should not ask the question I finally typed into a search engine when I was 44 years old. Forbidden is an ideograph. It sounds like it's describing a fact. The thing is forbidden, the way gravity is a force. It's not describing anything, it's performing something. Someone somewhere decided what was forbidden, and they decided it in a way that served their institutional needs, not yours. And then they taught it to you early enough that by the time you could think for yourself, the prohibition felt like it came from inside you rather than from them. Here's where Coogler and I land in the same place. When I married Mickey and brought him back to my hometown in southern Alberta, a town whose fence line runs along the Kainai Nation's territory, the word forbidden landed differently on each of us. I was the prodigal son who crossed a line drawn by the church. I was coming home for my 30th high school reunion. My black husband was navigating a geography of threat I'd never had to see, a landscape where forbidden had been enforced, not just doctrinally, but physically, economically, violently for centuries. Same word, different bodies, different consequences, but an identical power structure. The Puritan colonizers who became the Mormon pioneers carried the word forbidden from the New World to the Utah Territory, to the polygamous colonies in Alberta, to the missionary who stood at a swimming hole in Uruguay in 1979 and could not name what he felt for the boy standing beside him. 7 generations, same word, same work, defining who belongs, who deserves protection, and who must remain unnamed. Coogler's vampires must be invited in. The Mormon doctrine didn't need to force me in. It taught me to lock the door from the inside and then told me the lock was my own choice. So now I want to connect these stories, the film and the memoir, to a piece of theory that I think changes how you might see everything. A political scientist named Hugh Miller published a book in 2012 called Governing Narratives, right up here behind me. Miller argued something that sounds simple but is actually radical. Narratives don't just influence governance, narratives are governance. The stories a society tells about who belongs, who deserves what, and how things should work. Those stories aren't commentary on the system, they are the system. The institution doesn't exist independently of the narratives that sustain it. The institution is those narratives performed and reperformed every day. And Miller makes a distinction that unlocks everything. He separates what he calls ostensive narratives from performative narratives. An ostensive narrative is one that claims to describe how things really are. Marriage is between a man and a woman. The free market rewards merit. The algorithm is neutral. These narratives present themselves not as claims, but as descriptions of reality. To challenge them feels not like disagreement, but like denying an observable fact. A performative narrative, by contrast, is one that you see being produced. Someone is performing it. It looks like the table is permanently set. But actually, someone is setting it every morning, and they could set it differently if they wanted to. So now Miller brings me back to our two ideographs. Sin, in 1932 Mississippi, presented itself as ostensive. It's a divine truth, eternally settled. But it was being performed by preachers delivering sermons, by Jim Crow laws encoding racial hierarchy into statute, by a culture that made the blues dangerous and the juke joint a moral threat. Someone was setting that table every single day in 1932 Mississippi. Forbidden in the Mormon Church presented itself as ostensive, as an eternal commandment beyond human reinterpretation. But it was being performed by bishops reading letters from the first presidency from the pulpit, by Sunday school teachers delivering lessons, by parents transmitting the narrative to children who absorbed it the way you absorb grammar, not as a choice, but as a condition of your reality. In both cases, the ideograph did its work precisely because it looked permanent, because it looked like a fact rather than a performance. And the moment you see it as a performance, the moment you ask, who's setting this table and why? The ideograph's power doesn't disappear, but your relationship to it changes completely. So here's the question I want to leave with you. If a single word, sin, forbidden, freedom, liberty, can do this much political work in one church, in one community, in one family, for 7 generations like mine, what happens when the words aren't being chosen by a bishop or a preacher or a politician anymore? What happens when the words are being chosen by an algorithm? Every AI system you interact with, every search engine, every social media feed, every recommendation algorithm, every chatbot is making decisions about which narratives you will encounter and which ones disappear, like they don't exist. An algorithm is deciding which ideographs get amplified and which get buried. It's performing governing narratives at a scale no church, no government, no media empire in human history has ever achieved. And it's doing it without any democratic accountability whatsoever. That's not a technology problem. That's a governance problem. And it's the problem I spent 5 years in a PhD program trying to solve. I wrote 4 major research papers between 2011 and 2016 that derived a complete governance specification for AI narrative systems. 22 requirements across 6 layers, built not on what the technology can do, but on what democratic governance requires. I called it the Moxie architecture. Every single requirement, all 22 of them, were derived from existing theory in public administration, social psychology, narrative theory, or network science. None of them required new technology. All of them required political will, however. And the specification was finished before most of this technology existed. That timing mattered. It meant the architecture wasn't chasing the technology. The theory was already there. It was waiting for the technology to catch up. Every component of that architecture has since been independently developed by the technology industry. The crowdsourced content became social media. The structured metadata became knowledge graphs. The algorithmic retrieval of narrative threads became what the industry now calls retrieval augmented generation. The human feedback loop became reinforcement, learning from human feedback. Every piece exists. The democratic governance architecture that connects them does not. So here's what I'm asking you to do. I've recorded a 34-minute video that walks through all 22 requirements of that governance specification. It's on my site at driftlessrivers.us, no space. I'll put the link in the description here for this video. It's not a lecture. It's a measured walkthrough of what democratic governance for AI narrative systems actually looks like when you derive it from first principles. If this conversation meant something to you, if you heard the machinery in the word sin tonight, if you recognized the ideograph doing its work, then you're ready for the full architecture, because the question isn't whether AI narrative systems should be governed. They're already governing. The question is whether we're willing to specify what governance requires of AI. But before you go, I want to bring you back to Coogler for 1 second. Remember, the vampires had to be invited in. They could not cross the threshold without consent. Neither can the ideograph. The word sin has no power until you accept the authority of whoever defined it for you. The word forbidden has no power until you agree that someone else gets to decide what you're not allowed to want. The algorithm has no power over which stories you believe until you stop asking who chose those stories and why. So the question was never whether you're a sinner. The question was never whether your friends were forbidden. The question is, who built the church? Who wrote the algorithm? Who voted that politician in? And why they needed you to believe that it was you who locked the door yourself, not them. This is what voting in your own best interest looks like. VIYOBI. Vote in your own best interest. And you can't do that if the words you're thinking with were loaded by someone else before you were old enough to ask why. I'm Lester Levitt. The link is in the description. I will see you in the next VIYOBI.